The security gate recognized my temporary access code before my own father recognized my face. I stepped onto the long driveway with one olive drab duffel bag hanging from my shoulder, and before I even reached the front porch, I could hear applause spilling through the open doors. Somebody had hired a jazz trio. Crystal glasses clinked. Laughter bounced off the high ceilings like the house had been waiting for everyone except me. I stopped just inside the foyer while a catering manager hurried past carrying a tray of smoked salmon crostini. "Watch your left," she muttered without looking up. I smiled. "Already am. Old habits never leave you." A woman near the staircase glanced at my faded duffel and quietly moved her designer purse to the other side of her chair. That wasn't even the interesting part. The interesting part sat inside that bag, wrapped beneath two neatly folded t-shirts and a government-issued garment pouch. Nobody in that room knew it existed. By the time this story was over, that hidden weight would change every life standing inside this house. But nobody was looking at me. They were all looking at my sister. "To Tabitha!" someone shouted. Another round of applause erupted. Tabitha Sinclair stood beneath a massive floral arrangement wearing a cream-colored designer suit that probably cost more than my first pickup truck. She raised a champagne glass with the practiced smile of someone who believed cameras should always find her. "Our third luxury partnership in 18 months, she announced. 3 flagship locations before Christmas. The guests cheered again. My father stepped beside her, swirling a glass of 18-year-old scotch. That's exactly the kind of leadership Sinclair and Associates needs. Then his eyes drifted toward me. Just one glance. No smile, no hug, no welcome home. Instead, he looked back at the investors gathered around him. "As I was saying, once we secure the federal infrastructure contract, we'll expand into military design nationwide." That sentence was apparently more important than his daughter returning after years away. I set my duffel against the wall where it wouldn't block traffic. One of the servers asked if I needed help. "No thanks." She nodded. At least somebody asked. My father continued explaining projected revenue on a digital presentation displayed across a 75-inch screen. Numbers flashed beside architectural renderings of secure logistics facilities. Projected value, $48,600,000, completion timeline, 26 months. Someone asked, "How confident are you?" Dad smiled. "We've cultivated excellent defense relationships." I almost laughed, not because the contract was impossible. Because I already recognized 2 technical mistakes on slide 4. Nobody else did. Tabitha finally noticed me. There she is. She walked over carefully, air-kissed somewhere near my cheek, then stepped back to inspect my clothes. "You still own that bag? It still carries things. I suppose that's one way to look at it." She laughed at her own joke. "So, are you finally done playing Army?" Same difference. She linked her arm through mine before I could answer. "Come meet everyone." She didn't actually introduce me. She introduced herself again. "And this," she said casually, "is my younger sister Audra." She worked somewhere with Army paperwork. A man in a navy blazer nodded politely. "Oh, administration?" I answered before Tabitha could. "Something like that. It was easier. The truth usually created paperwork." Dad never corrected her. He was too busy explaining that his company had recently invested $612,840 into renovating the West Wing, specifically to impress federal clients. That number sounded suspiciously precise. Knowing Dad, he'd probably memorized every invoice. He remembered contractor receipts better than birthdays. Someone handed me a sparkling water. I thanked them. Another guest asked whether I planned to stay in Ohio. "I haven't decided." Dad answered for me. "She'll figure something out." That was apparently the official family plan. Figure something out. No questions about where I'd been. No curiosity about what I'd done. No interest in why I'd spent years disappearing behind military gates. Just figure something out. Funny thing is, I'd spent most of my adult life solving problems people weren't even allowed to know existed. The pianist shifted into another song while guests drifted toward the hallway. Dad lifted his glass. "Ladies and gentlemen, before dinner, I'd love to show you our newest renovation." Everyone all followed him. The Legacy Hall. The name alone sounded expensive. Italian white oak parquet stretched across the floor beneath custom lighting imported from Milan. Framed family photographs lined the walls between architectural awards. Only one child appeared consistently. Tabitha, horse shows, ribbon ceremonies, magazine covers, ribbon cuttings, private school graduation. Her riding trophies occupied an entire illuminated display worth more than some families' kitchens. Dad stood proudly beside them. Every one of these represents discipline. Guests admired the polished silver cups. Someone whistled. Incredible collection. Dad nodded with unmistakable pride. Then he noticed me stepping toward the hallway with my duffel still over my shoulder. His smile disappeared. Audra. Everyone turned. He pointed toward the side entrance used by gardeners and delivery drivers. Use the back entrance. I looked down at my boots. They were clean. I don't want dirt on the imported Italian parquet, he continued. Those floors cost $187 per square foot. Several guests chuckled politely. Nobody challenged him. I picked up my duffel again. Sure. I turned toward the back hallway without another word. Behind me, Dad resumed talking about craftsmanship. Ahead of me, an old service staircase led toward the apartment above the garage where I'd be staying. As I climbed the first step, my bag shifted against my shoulder. Metal touched metal inside, soft, almost silent. The sound made me stop for just a second, because I knew exactly what rested beneath those folded shirts. And if my father thought imported flooring was the most valuable thing under his roof tonight, he was about to learn how wrong a man could be. I carried my duffel upstairs, shut the apartment door behind me, and left every metal exactly where it belonged, out of sight. That had been my rule for years. People couldn't weaponize what they didn't know existed. I unpacked in less than 15 minutes. 2 pairs of jeans, 3 plain shirts, running shoes, a shaving kit. My army-issued footlocker sat untouched against the far wall, still secured with the same heavy padlock I'd used overseas. Most people would have expected it to hold weapons or souvenirs. Instead, it held pieces of a life I had never tried to explain. Downstairs, laughter rolled through the house again. Dinner wasn't for another hour, but the guests had already migrated toward the patio, where the caterers were serving bourbon-glazed short ribs on tiny ceramic spoons. I changed into a clean navy sweater and headed back down. The moment I stepped outside, Tabitha spotted me. There she is. She waved me over to a circle of investors as if she were introducing an intern. My little sister finally escaped government life. A silver-haired woman smiled politely. What did you do in the army? Before I could answer, Tabitha jumped in. Oh, nothing dangerous. She laughed. She handled paperwork, inventory, shipping receipts. Probably spent her whole career in a warehouse with fluorescent lights. The group chuckled. I took a sip of iced tea. Close enough. The woman nodded sympathetically. Well, somebody has to keep things organized. Exactly, Tabitha said. Not everyone is cut out for leadership. She turned toward me. I always figured the army liked having people who didn't ask too many questions. I smiled. They definitely appreciate organized paperwork. That answer satisfied everyone, because it sounded boring. Boring was safe. Boring kept classified operations classified. The truth had signatures attached to it that still belonged to the federal government. A young investment analyst asked me whether military work translated well into civilian jobs. I'm sure she'll find an office somewhere, Tabitha answered again. Maybe logistics. Dad overheard the conversation while walking past. Government experience always looks respectable on a resume. That was his contribution. Not congratulations, not curiosity, just resume advice. The funny thing was that if anyone in that yard had actually seen my resume, most of it would have been black bars and security clearance language they weren't authorized to read. I let them keep their version. It cost me nothing, or at least that's what I kept telling myself. Dinner was served inside at a custom walnut table long enough to seat 18 people. Crystal glasses, linen napkins, place cards. Dad had assigned seats based on who might eventually invest in Sinclair and Associates. I noticed I wasn't seated near him. I was between an accountant from Columbus and a retired orthodontist who wanted to talk about fishing. Honestly, he was the nicest person in the room. Halfway through the first course, Tabitha looked down the table. Audra, yeah? Did you ever actually leave a desk? A few guests looked over. I traveled. For conferences? No. She grinned. So, warehouse inspections? I shrugged. Sometimes. She laughed hard enough that Julian joined in without even knowing the joke. See? Tabitha said. I told you. She leaned toward one of the guests. She was never the adventurous one. Then she looked back at me with that familiar smile she'd practiced since we were kids. You know, I always thought the army accepted you because they needed dependable people, not glamorous ones. A couple of uncomfortable laughs drifted around the table. She kept going. Let's be honest, you were never exactly built for the luxury retail world. Julian added, or public relations. Definitely not public relations, Tabitha agreed. I mean, charisma matters. I buttered a dinner roll. They made me wear the same thing every day anyway. That earned another laugh. Only this time it came from the accountant sitting beside me. He appreciated dry humor. Tabitha thought I was agreeing with her. She had no idea I'd spent years sitting across from people who measured conversations diligently. Sometimes the biggest threat wasn't the loudest voice. It was the person talking just a little too confidently. Julian fit that profile perfectly. By the second course, he had redirected the conversation toward himself. Dad practically invited it. So, Julian, he asked proudly, how are things progressing with your defense contacts? Julian straightened his tie. Very well. He took a slow drink of wine. I've been speaking with people at the Pentagon every week. Dad nodded with obvious admiration. I knew those relationships would pay off. Julian smiled wider. You'd be amazed how often the Joint Chiefs call for input. I nearly inhaled my water. Call him, the Joint Chiefs, every week? Interesting. A venture capitalist asked, really? Julian nodded confidently. Oh, absolutely. We discuss procurement strategies, modernization priorities, infrastructure planning. He sprinkled in enough buzzwords to impress civilians. Joint logistics integration, strategic readiness, asset deployment architecture. The words sounded expensive. They also sounded randomly assembled. Dad looked genuinely impressed. I've always said networking separates successful people from everyone else. Julian continued. Last Tuesday, I was advising them on a classified acquisition pipeline. I reached for my napkin before anyone noticed the corner of my mouth trying to move. Because classified acquisition pipelines don't get discussed over casual phone calls, and nobody who actually worked inside that system would describe them that way. He kept talking. I've practically memorized the procurement process. No, you hadn't. I dabbed my mouth with the linen napkin and watched him explain defense contracting with the confidence of someone reading instructions upside down. He confused contracting officers with program executive offices. He mixed operational commands with acquisition authorities. Then he mentioned a procurement document by the wrong title. That one almost made me laugh out loud. Not because the mistake was small, because it proved he'd never even opened the document he claimed to discuss every week. He had no idea how to read a defense procurement manifest, not the real one, not even the first page. I looked across the table at my father. He believed every word. And for the first time since walking back into the Sinclair estate, I realized the most dangerous person in this family wasn't the one telling lies. It was the one who desperately wanted to believe them. I left the house before breakfast was over and pointed my truck toward the Franklin Veterans Recovery Clinic instead of another family gathering. Nobody noticed, or if they did, nobody asked where I was going. That worked in my favor. Every few weeks, I volunteered at the clinic. Most of the men and women there didn't care about rank, titles, or impressive resumes. They wanted someone who could sit beside them without turning every conversation into a motivational speech. Mr. Donnelly wanted help setting up a new tablet so he could video call his granddaughter. Sergeant Ellis beat me at checkers again. You still telegraph your moves, he teased. I'll blame the Army. You people blame everything on the Army. We both laughed. It felt good. Simple conversations usually do. Before leaving, I signed the visitor log at 12:18 p.m., dropped a donation envelope into the front desk mailbox, and promised Mr. Donnelly I'd come back the following month with better coffee than whatever the vending machine kept pretending was coffee. Meanwhile, back at the Sinclair estate, something very different was happening. I didn't learn every detail until much later. Some of it came from the housekeeper. Some came from the security camera footage Dad forgot existed over the garage entrance. The rest practically announced itself when I returned. Dad had spent the morning arguing with his chief financial officer over speakerphone. The firm's cash flow wasn't what he'd promised investors. One payment from a commercial project had been delayed. Another client wanted contract revisions before releasing the next $813,600 installment. Julian, naturally, had a solution. If Audra has retirement savings, he suggested, maybe she also has investment accounts. Tabitha nodded immediately. Or military bonuses. Dad frowned. She wouldn't volunteer that information. Julian leaned back. Then maybe she keeps financial records upstairs. It should have ended there. Instead, Dad stood. Let's take a look. According to the housekeeper, Martha, she heard them climbing the service staircase around 1:40. She assumed they were bringing me fresh towels. She never imagined they were carrying a pry bar borrowed from the maintenance shed. The apartment door wasn't locked. They walked in anyway. Julian searched desk drawers. Tabitha opened closet shelves. Dad flipped through folders on my bookshelf, tax returns, insurance papers, vehicle registration. Nothing interesting, nothing valuable, nothing they could use. Then Julian noticed the footlocker, military green, heavy steel corners, government property markings partially sanded away years earlier. There, Dad walked over. What do you think? Probably financial records. Tabitha folded her arms, or cash. Dad tried the padlock, locked. He hesitated, for maybe 3 seconds. Julian handed him the pry bar. I'll replace the lock afterward. That sentence somehow made the whole thing acceptable, at least in their minds. Metal scraped against metal. The lock resisted, then finally snapped. The sound echoed through the apartment. Dad lifted the lid. Inside, everything had been packed exactly the way I'd left it. Pressed uniforms, field notebooks, old photographs, certificates sealed inside waterproof sleeves. Each layer folded with the kind of precision military habits never completely erase. Tabitha frowned. Seriously? She picked up one uniform. You even fold your clothes like they're still inspecting you. Julian dug deeper. No bank statements, no stock portfolios, no deeds. Dad searched another compartment. Then he found the velvet case, dark blue, no label. He opened it carefully. The room went quiet. Even Julian stopped moving. Inside rested my Bronze Star medal with valor. Beside it lay my Meritorious Service medal. The ribbons looked almost untouched because I almost never displayed them. Dad stared. I've seen these before. Julian nodded slowly. Those aren't ordinary medals. He wasn't wrong. Even without understanding them, he recognized they represented something significant. For one brief moment, there was silence. Not respect, just uncertainty. Dad picked up the Bronze Star by its ribbon. It feels real. It is real, Martha later told me. She whispered to herself downstairs without knowing why. Upstairs, nobody heard her. Tabitha finally broke the silence. Then she laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not an awkward laugh. A full theatrical laugh that bounced off the apartment walls. Oh my God. She looked at Julian. Are we seriously supposed to believe this? Julian smirked. I've seen replica websites, so have I. She picked up the Meritorious Service Medal and held it toward the window. These are actually pretty convincing. Dad's expression hardened. You think she bought them? Tabitha laughed even harder. What else makes sense? She looked around the apartment. She spent years telling everyone she worked in military paperwork. Then she waved the medal. Now suddenly she's some decorated war hero? Julian shrugged. You can order almost anything online. Exactly. Tabitha rolled her eyes. There are surplus stores all over Ohio. She wasn't finished. Or maybe one of those Chinese replica sites. She tossed the velvet case onto the bed. I almost feel bad. Dad looked at her. Why? Because this is actually sad. She shook her head with exaggerated pity. Imagine feeling so invisible that you buy fake medals just to make yourself interesting. Julian chuckled. That's honestly kind of pathetic. No, Tabitha corrected. It's desperate. She glanced around my apartment again. The tiny room, the boring clothes, the lonely little life. Then she smiled with the kind of confidence only someone completely certain they couldn't be wrong possesses. I guess pretending to be a hero is cheaper than becoming one. Dad didn't defend me. He didn't ask questions. He didn't consider that his daughter might have earned something he couldn't explain. Instead, he slowly closed the velvet case and carried it downstairs. By the time I pulled into the driveway that afternoon, the broken padlock was back on the footlocker, hanging just crooked enough that anyone who knew it well would spot the difference before taking a second step into the room. I knew someone had entered my apartment the second I pushed the door open. Nothing looked messy. That was the mistake. People who don't spend years living out of military lockers think putting everything back is enough. It isn't. The footlocker latch leaned 2 degrees lower than usual. The blanket covering it had been folded left over right instead of right over left. The broken padlock clicked differently when I picked it up. Someone had forced it open. I didn't say a word. I simply replaced the lock with the spare I kept inside my duffel bag and went downstairs for Sunday brunch. Exactly when Martha announced breakfast was ready. The dining room had been transformed overnight. Instead of investors, Today's guests wore golf jackets embroidered with the logo of Black Ridge Country Club. Retired judges, physicians, developers, and their spouses filled the long table while servers poured coffee into bone china cups. Dad loved Sunday brunch. It was where reputations were polished. Every conversation sounded like a networking event disguised as scrambled eggs. I took the empty seat nearest the end of the table. Tabitha smiled into her phone before glancing at me. There she is. She was already recording short videos for her social media page. According to her, authenticity was the newest luxury brand. Ironically, she'd never been interested in either. Brunch had barely started when Dad stood. He tapped a spoon against his coffee cup. "Ladies and gentlemen," the room quieted immediately. "I need to address something unfortunate." I looked up. His expression wasn't angry, it was disappointed. That was always more dangerous. He reached beneath the buffet table. Then he placed a familiar blue velvet case on top of the white tablecloth. Every muscle in my shoulders relaxed instead of tightening. So that's what this was. Dad opened the lid slowly enough for everyone to see. Gasps drifted around the room. The Bronze Star with Valor, the Meritorious Service Medal. Sunlight caught the medal just long enough for several guests to lean closer. Dad looked directly at me. "Audra." His voice carried across the room. "I gave you every opportunity to tell me the truth. I said nothing." He lifted the Bronze Star between two fingers. "I found these in your room." Another silence. Then he sighed dramatically. "I honestly hoped they were family keepsakes." He shook his head. "But apparently they're part of a fantasy." Several people exchanged uncomfortable looks. One man quietly whispered, "Surely not," Dad continued. "Some of you served." He nodded toward two veterans sitting near the fireplace. "You understand exactly what these medals represent." The older men looked at the ribbon without saying anything. Dad turned back toward me. "Fabricating military honors isn't just embarrassing." He paused deliberately. "It's stolen valor." The phrase landed exactly where he wanted it to. Several guests looked away from me. Others stared with open disbelief. Dad's voice hardened. "It is a disgrace to every man and woman who actually earned recognition through sacrifice." He pointed toward the medals. "And it's a federal offense." The irony almost made me smile, not because he was accusing me, because he had spent 30 years teaching clients to verify facts before making public statements. Apparently that rule stopped at family. Tabitha had already opened her phone again. I caught a glimpse of the screen. She wasn't texting. She was posting. She angled the camera just enough to include the velvet case while carefully avoiding the faces of guests. Her caption appeared as she typed. "Some people need professional help more than public sympathy." "Family truth," she frowned. No hashtags. She deleted them, then she tried again. It's heartbreaking when someone builds an entire personality around imaginary achievements. She hit publish. Within seconds, her phone buzzed. Likes, comments, sympathy. Exactly what she'd ordered. Julian leaned back confidently. "I've seen this before." Nobody asked him. He answered anyway. "Some veterans struggle after leaving service." He lowered his voice into fake compassion. "They reinvent themselves." I almost laughed. Julian couldn't identify a legitimate procurement manifest, but apparently he was now a psychologist. A woman across the table looked at me gently. "Honey, I'm sure counseling could help." That one almost hurt. Not because she meant harm, because she genuinely believed Dad. Compassion built on a lie still leaves damage behind. Dad closed the velvet case with a sharp snap. "I won't allow the Sinclair name to become associated with fraud." He looked at every guest before looking back at me. "I expect you to explain yourself." I folded my napkin once, then again. Finally, I placed it beside my plate. No speech, no defense, no list of deployments. No mention of Kabul. No mention of the classified operation that began inside a concrete command room where every watch had been synchronized to the second before the first encrypted signal crossed the border. No mention of the night those medals were earned. Some stories don't belong at brunch. Some promises don't expire because someone insults you. I stood. Every eye followed me. Dad waited. So I walked around the table until only a few feet separated us. His hand still rested on the velvet case. I looked at it, then at him. He expected anger, excuses, maybe tears. Instead, I simply met his eyes. Years in intelligence work teach you something useful. Most people can only hold confident eye contact while they believe they're right. The moment doubt enters, their eyes search for somewhere safer to land. Dad lasted maybe 6 seconds. His gaze drifted toward the window. Just once. That was enough. I leaned forward slightly so only he could hear me. You should have kept that box closed, Dad. I stepped around him and walked toward the hallway. Nobody stopped me. Behind me, the dining room remained completely silent, not because anyone suddenly believed me, because for the first time that morning, my father was no longer looking at his guests. He was staring at the closed velvet case, as though it had become something far heavier than two medals resting inside it. I kept walking until the voices behind me dissolved into the clatter of dishes. But by Monday morning, the house was acting as if the brunch disaster had never happened. The Sinclair estate never stayed embarrassed for long. Dad believed every public failure could be erased by hosting a more important guest. 3 days after accusing me of stolen valor in front of half the country club, he gathered the executive team in the library. I wasn't invited, but the walls in that house had never been especially loyal. By lunchtime, Martha quietly knocked on my apartment door. They're celebrating downstairs. What happened? Mr. Ashcroft says he pulled off a miracle. I followed her downstairs just in time to hear Julian announcing the news. Ladies and gentlemen, next Thursday evening, General Thaddeus Campbell will be joining us for a private dinner. The room exploded with excitement. Dad actually slapped Julian on the shoulder. I knew you could make it happen. Julian accepted the praise, like a movie star accepting an award. It wasn't easy. The general's office turned down 2 previous invitations. But they accepted yours? One project manager asked. Julian smiled. I've built relationships. I lowered my eyes before my expression betrayed me. People at General Campbell's level didn't casually accept dinner invitations from defense brokers looking for business. If the invitation had been accepted at all, there were almost certainly official staff involved, background reviews, scheduling requirements, and legal guidance. Julian made it sound like he had texted an old fishing buddy. Dad didn't care. All he heard was opportunity. The military logistics initiative alone could bring this company over $50 million during the next 5 years. He turned toward the conference table. We are going to make a flawless impression. That sentence became everyone's full-time job. For the next several days, contractors polished stone columns that already reflected sunlight. Fresh flowers arrived every morning. A local chef submitted 4 revised dinner menus before Dad finally approved the 5th. I accidentally saw one invoice lying beside his laptop. Event production, $18,742.60. Apparently, Dignity could be rented by the hour. Nobody asked whether I planned to attend. Dad answered that question himself. He knocked on my apartment door the evening before the dinner. You'll be downstairs tomorrow. I assumed so. You won't be sitting with us. I assumed that, too. He ignored the comment. I need you dressed modestly. He looked me over as though evaluating a piece of furniture. Dark colors. No bright jewelry, no attention. I nodded. Fine. You'll help the catering staff. I've never worked for a catering company. You can carry trays. His voice remained perfectly calm. And make sure General Campbell's glass never stays empty. That was my assignment. Not daughter, not guest. Server. Dad started walking away, then stopped. One more thing, yeah? Stay in the background. I almost smiled. I've had a lot of practice. He either missed the joke or pretended to. By late afternoon, the estate looked more like a boutique hotel than a family home. The chef coordinated plating with military precision. White-gloved servers rehearsed routes between the dining room and the terrace. Julian wandered around holding a leather portfolio he never opened. He wanted everyone to notice it. Successful people often mistake carrying a folder for having something important inside it. I helped arrange water glasses because standing still invited conversations I wasn't interested in having. One young server whispered, "You family?" Technically, she laughed. "I thought you worked here." So did my father. She blinked, unsure whether I was joking. Honestly, so was I. Around 5:20 p.m., I walked into the kitchen looking for bottled mineral water. Julian followed me inside and quietly shut the swinging door behind him. The sounds of the dining room faded immediately. His friendly smile disappeared. "We should talk." "I don't think we should." "I do." He stepped closer. "I know exactly what you're doing." I picked up a tray. "No, you don't. You've been doing this for what?" To impress the general." I almost laughed. "I've never met him." "Don't play games." He lowered his voice. "Tomorrow isn't about you. It never is." He ignored that. "I told Gideon your little warehouse story." "My what?" "The clerical supply job." He pointed toward me. "That's your role." I never argued with it. "Good." He nodded once. "Keep it that way." I set the tray back onto the counter. You seem nervous. I'm practical. No. I looked directly at him. You're nervous. For the first time, he looked away before I did. Then he recovered. If you start talking about military work, I haven't. If you mention classified projects, I won't. If you decide to embarrass me by pretending you're anything more than a supply clerk, his voice hardened, I'll make sure Gideon cuts off every bit of support you've got. I waited. He wasn't finished. I'll have your healthcare canceled. That almost made me smile. My veteran's healthcare had absolutely nothing to do with my father. Julian didn't know that. And, he continued, I'll convince him to freeze your access to your grandmother's estate. That one landed differently. Grandma Eleanor had created a modest trust years earlier to maintain the family cemetery and preserve several pieces of farmland she'd refused to sell. I wasn't living off it, but I had been appointed one of the trustees after her death. Julian clearly assumed it was another allowance Dad controlled. He had no idea how probate law worked, or trust law, or military benefits. Confidence really was his favorite substitute for knowledge. He leaned closer. So keep your mouth shut about your little clerical supply duties. I picked up the tray again. You finished? He frowned. Did you hear me? Every word. And? I looked at him for a long second. I've spent most of my adult life protecting information that wasn't mine to share. Then I walked past him without raising my voice. I don't think silence is going to be the difficult part tomorrow. He stayed in the kitchen watching me leave. Behind me, the chef announced that the first course was ready for rehearsal. Ahead of me, the dining room sparkled under polished chandeliers. Waiting for a guest everyone believed they understood far better than they actually did. Between minutes 45 and 55, keep an eye on the story waiting in the top right corner of your screen. The family sitting in front of me wasn't the first to mistake confidence for truth, and another case we covered took that mistake to an even more unbelievable place. I closed my apartment door behind me and rested both hands on the edge of the dresser, while the sounds of crystal glasses and polite laughter drifted up through the floor. The dinner had already begun downstairs. Servers were making their final passes. Outside, headlights swept across the front windows every few minutes as another guest arrived. I looked at the garment bag hanging from the closet door. Beside it, neatly folded on the bed, lay a simple black dress. Someone had left it there while I was down helping the catering staff. A handwritten note rested on top. This will be appropriate for tonight. No signature. It didn't need one. Dad never wrote unnecessary words. I picked up the dress. It was expensive, classic. Forgettable, exactly what he wanted. A woman who blended into the wallpaper. Someone who carried trays without becoming part of the conversation. I laid the dress back on the bed. Then I opened the garment bag. The zipper slid down with a sound I hadn't heard in months. Inside hung my U.S. Army service uniform, freshly pressed. Every crease exactly where regulations required it. I ran 2 fingers across the sleeve. There was something strangely calming about familiar fabric. No speeches, no memories flooding back, just routine. The same routine I'd followed before inspections, ceremonies, promotions, and funerals. Routine keeps your hands steady when emotions don't. I hung the uniform on the closet door and reached for the small storage case inside the footlocker. The new padlock clicked open smoothly, unlike the broken one my family had replaced. They had searched this box looking for money, instead stumbled into a life they couldn't understand. I lifted out the velvet case. For a few seconds, I simply looked at it, not because of what was inside, because I remembered exactly why I'd hidden it. I hadn't been ashamed. I'd been tired. Tired of explaining things I wasn't allowed to explain. Tired of watching conversations stop the moment someone heard the word classified. Tired of becoming the story instead of simply living my life. Silence had been easier until it wasn't. I thought about brunch. About strangers offering counseling because my father had convinced them I was delusional. About Tabitha filming my humiliation for social media. About Julian threatening benefits he didn't even understand. Something finally became obvious. Silence hadn't protected peace. It had protected cruelty. Every lie they invented had survived because I kept stepping aside to avoid conflict. Every insult had found room to grow because I never corrected it. There comes a point where staying quiet stops being kindness. It becomes permission. I wasn't interested in revenge. I was finished volunteering for disrespect. I opened the velvet case. The Bronze Star rested exactly where I'd left it. Beside it sat the Valor device. Then the Meritorious Service Medal. In another compartment lay my Master Analyst Identification Badge. Each piece represented years measured by deployments instead of birthdays. None of them had ever been earned alone. Every medal carried names that would never appear engraved on the back. I whispered one of those names anyway. Morales. Then another, Kim. People rarely understand that military decorations belong as much to the people beside you as the person wearing them. I reached for the uniform jacket. One pin at a time. Nothing rushed, nothing dramatic. Regulation existed for a reason. The Bronze Star first, alignment checked, adjusted, measured against the seam, the Valor device, centered straight. Then the remaining insignia, Master Analyst Badge, nameplate, service ribbons. Each one settled into place with quiet precision. I'd stepped back. 1 millimeter mattered, sometimes less. I'd checked everything again in the mirror, then once more, not because anyone downstairs deserved perfection, because the uniform did. Outside my apartment window, I saw black SUVs beginning to enter the front gate. The General's advanced security team. Right on schedule, professional, unremarkable, exactly how professionals preferred to arrive. Downstairs, I heard Dad greeting another guest. His voice carried easily through the open foyer. General Campbell appreciates discipline. I almost smiled. He had no idea. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. Martha opened the door slightly. They're serving the first course. I'll be down. She looked at me, then stopped speaking altogether. For several long seconds, finally she smiled. Not a surprised smile, not admiration, recognition. I wondered what? If your father knew who he was talking to. I answered honestly, no. She nodded once. I didn't think so. She quietly closed the door. I picked up my service cap but decided to leave it behind. The uniform spoke clearly enough without it. As I reached the staircase overlooking the foyer, the first course was already leaving the kitchen. Servers crossed the marble floor carrying white porcelain plates. Julian stood near the dining room, rehearsing his smile. Tabitha adjusted flower arrangements one last time. Dad accepted compliments on the renovation, as though he'd personally carved every piece of wood in the house. Then I took the first step down. Conversation continued. Another step. Nobody noticed. Halfway down the staircase, one server looked up. His eyes widened. He stopped walking. The movement caught someone else's attention. Then another. One by one, conversations died without anyone asking for silence. Dad turned instinctively toward the staircase. The smile disappeared from his face before he had fully recognized me. His eyes dropped to my chest. The Bronze Star, the Valor device, the Master Analyst Badge, the very decorations he had dismissed as surplus store junk. Color drained from his face, then rushed back all at once until his cheeks burned crimson. For a moment, he looked like a man trying to decide whether he was furious or terrified. Neither expression suited him nearly as well as the truth that had just walked into his own house. I reached the bottom step before anyone found enough words to interrupt the silence. Dad crossed the foyer so fast that one of the servers nearly dropped a tray of roasted sea bass. Audra. His voice stayed low. Come with me. He wasn't asking. I followed him without protest. People always assume the calm person has surrendered. Sometimes the calm person's is simply conserving energy. He pushed open the butler's pantry door, waited until it closed behind us, then rounded on me. The smile he'd been wearing for the guests vanished completely. What the hell are you doing? Wearing my uniform. You know exactly what I mean. He pointed at my chest with a trembling finger. Take those things off. I looked down briefly. My name tag, the medals. His voice became a harsh whisper. The plastic toys. Interesting. 3 days ago, they had been fake federal evidence. Now they were plastic toys. Apparently, the accusation changed depending on the audience. You heard me. He took one step closer. Take them off, right now. I didn't move. Outside the pantry, I could hear dishes being placed on the dining table. Someone laughed. A cork popped from a bottle. Life continued exactly as scheduled. Inside the room, my father looked like he was trying to hold back a storm with his bare hands. You've embarrassed this family enough. I walked downstairs. You staged this. No. You planned this ridiculous performance because you're jealous. That almost made me smile. Of what? His jaw tightened. Your sister. There it was. Everything eventually came back to Tabitha. She's built a successful career. I know. You couldn't stand watching everyone celebrate her. I did. So now, you've decided to play soldier. I already played soldier. He ignored the correction. This is nothing more than a tantrum. I folded my hands behind my back. The posture made him even angrier. I spent years building the Sinclair name. I know. And tonight matters. I know. General Campbell could change this company's future. I know. He stared at me for several seconds. Then why are you doing this? The answer was surprisingly simple. I'm not hiding anymore. He laughed once. It wasn't humor. It was disbelief. You think this makes you important? No. You think people will salute a costume? I haven't asked anyone to. He rubbed both hands across his face. You don't understand what's at stake. I looked at him quietly. I understand more than you think. No, you don't. His voice rose before he forced it back down. If Julian secures this contract, your sister's future is protected. My uniform doesn't affect that. It absolutely does. He jabbed another finger toward my chest. You're making us look ridiculous. No, you are. For the first time, he looked genuinely shocked that I had answered him directly. He stepped closer until only inches separated us. If General Campbell walks in here and sees you dressed like this, he'll see a retired army captain. He'll see a liar. I didn't answer. Dad mistook silence for weakness. He always had. He tried a different approach. If you care about this family, I waited. You'll change clothes. No. If you care about me, no. His eyes narrowed. You'd choose those fake medals over your own father? I held his gaze. I'm choosing the truth. He slammed his palm against the pantry shelf. Glasses rattled. I've had enough. His voice dropped into something colder. If you walk out of this room wearing that uniform, he paused. Don't ever call me your father again. The words hung there, heavy, permanent. Most people imagine ultimatums feel dramatic. They don't. They're usually quiet, like paperwork being signed, like a door closing, like someone deciding that love only exists if obedience comes with it. For just a second, I looked at the man standing in front of me. Not the architect, not the businessman, just my father. I remembered him teaching me to ride a bicycle, helping with 6th grade math, buying me my first pair of work gloves. Those memories were real. So was the man threatening to erase me because of a uniform. Both versions existed. One didn't cancel the other. The pantry door swung open slightly. Julian peeked inside. There you are. He stepped in without waiting. General Campbell's con just left the hotel. Dad turned immediately. How long? Julian checked his phone. About 20 minutes. Then he noticed me still standing there. His face tightened. She's still wearing it? Dad answered for me. She's refusing. Julian sighed dramatically. Unbelievable. He looked directly at me. Take the medals off. No. They're going to ask questions. Maybe. You'll ruin everything. I won't. He laughed. You honestly think the general is going to care about some retired supply clerk? I looked at him without blinking. No, I didn't think so. He turned back toward Dad. We don't have time for this. Actually, we did. I slowly raised my left wrist. The silver military watch had traveled farther than anyone in that house knew. The crystals carried one tiny scratch near the edge from a concrete stairwell overseas. It still kept perfect time. I checked it, then looked at both of them. At 18, I said calmly, the general enters this gate. Neither man spoke. You can stand here arguing with my uniform. I shifted my eyes toward Julian. Or you can prepare to explain why your son-in-law's logistics proposal uses military codes I personally retired 3 years ago. Silence. Real silence. Not the polite kind from brunch. Julian's confidence disappeared first. His forehead tightened. What did you just say? I lowered my wrist. I think you heard me. Dad stared at Julian. Julian stared at me. Neither one knew which question should be asked first. And outside the front windows, the distant glow of approaching headlights swept slowly across the estate wall. I walked past both of them and took my place beside the marble column overlooking the front courtyard. Nobody told me where to stand. That was probably for the best. If Dad had assigned positions, he would have hidden me behind the catering staff and a 6-foot flower arrangement. Instead, I chose the edge of the porch where I could see the front gate without becoming part of the receiving line. The evening had become strangely quiet. Not because the guests had stopped talking, because everyone had started listening. The staff sensed something was wrong. They didn't know what. But people who work high-end events develop good instincts. One server whispered to another, "Why is Mr. Sinclair sweating? He wasn't 10 minutes ago." Neither realized the answer was standing 20 feet away in dress uniform. Dad had reorganized the welcoming line 3 separate times. First, he wanted Julian closest to the driveway. Then he decided he should stand there himself. Then he moved everyone again after deciding photographs would look more balanced. Tabitha adjusted her jacket for what felt like the 100th time. Does this angle make me look taller? Julian barely looked at her. He kept checking his phone. Refreshing, locking it, refreshing again. His leather presentation portfolio never left his hand. I wondered if he'd actually read what was inside. Judging from our conversation in the pantry, probably not. One of the assistants approached Dad. The advance vehicle just checked in. Dad straightened immediately, everyone ready. The catering manager quietly motioned for servers to service until introductions were complete. Crystal glasses stopped moving. Kitchen doors stayed shut. The estate held its breath. Then the heavy iron gates began to open, slowly, deliberately. A black armored SUV rolled through first. Behind it came a second security vehicle. No flashing lights, no unnecessary drama, just disciplined movement, exactly what I'd expected. The lead vehicle stopped. A security agent stepped out first. Dark suit, earpiece, quick visual sweep. Professional. He exchanged a few quiet words with another agent before nodding toward the rear passenger door. Julian immediately stepped off the porch. Dad hissed through clenched teeth, "Wait until they're clear." Julian either didn't hear him or chose not to. He hurried across the stone walkway wearing the smile of a man convinced cameras should already be rolling. The rear passenger door opened. General Thaddeus Campbell stepped out. Even in civilian business attire, there was nothing casual about him. Some people announce authority by talking, others simply carry it. He thanked the driver with a small nod before adjusting the cuff of his jacket. No dramatic entrance, no performance. Julian extended his hand before the general had taken 3 steps. "General Campbell," his voice boomed across the courtyard. What an absolute honor. The general turned politely. Julian launched forward before anyone could interrupt. "I'm Julian Ashcroft." He laughed as though greeting an old friend. "We've crossed paths through Colonel Hastings." No reaction. "And Colonel Mercer sends his regards." Still nothing. Julian kept going. "I was actually discussing strategic logistics with Colonel Donovan just last week." Interesting. The night before, I'd overheard him practicing those names in the library after searching publicly available biographies online. Unfortunately for him, one of those officers had retired nearly 2 years earlier. Another had never worked in the command he had just referenced. The general's expression never changed. Julian continued anyway. "I've admired your modernization initiatives for years." Dad finally joined them. "General, welcome to the Sinclair estate." The general shook Dad's hand politely. "Thank you." His voice remained calm, measured, professional. No warmth, no familiarity. Exactly the tone senior officers use when attending required functions. Tabitha stepped forward next. "We're so honored." She offered her brightest public relations smile. "We've planned a wonderful evening." The general nodded courteously. "Thank you." Julian wasn't finished. He laughed again. "I was just telling everyone about some fascinating Pentagon conversations." That sentence actually caused one of the security agents to glance toward him. Very briefly, professionals noticed strange claims. The general didn't encourage the topic. Instead, he adjusted his jacket again. Julian stubbornly kept talking. "I imagine you've spoken recently with General Atkinson." There wasn't a General Atkinson serving in the position Julian had referenced. "Not anymore." Dad interrupted before the mistake grew larger. "We're excited to present our proposal." Julian immediately lifted the leather portfolio. "I've developed several logistics concepts personally." The general looked toward the folder, then back toward Julian. Still no expression, no excitement, no recognition, nothing. It was like watching someone politely listen to a stranger explaining the rules of a sport they had invented. Then something changed. Not dramatically, almost imperceptibly. The general's attention shifted. His eyes moved past Julian's extended hand, past Dad's expensive suit, past Tabitha's carefully rehearsed smile, past the polished limestone columns, past the imported flower arrangements, past every carefully constructed symbol of wealth standing on that porch. His gaze continued moving until it reached the shadow beside the marble column. Me. For one brief second, nothing else in the courtyard seemed to exist. Julian was still talking. The words simply stopped mattering. The general wasn't listening anymore. His eyes settled on my service uniform. Then lower, the ribbons, the bronze star, the Valor device, the Master Analyst badge. Recognition arrived before a single word was spoken. I had seen that expression before, not often, usually between people who had shared information that couldn't be discussed in public. The conversation around us dissolved into meaningless background noise. Dad noticed first. He turned toward me, then toward the general, then back again. Confusion spread slowly across his face. Julian Line finally realized no one was paying attention to him. He followed the general's line of sight. So, he laughed awkwardly. That's just my sister-in-law. Nobody answered him. Because every person on that porch had just become an audience to something none of them understood. And General Thaddeus Campbell had not taken another single step toward the front door. The general's eyes stayed on me long enough that everyone else finally stopped, pretending nothing unusual was happening. Julian lowered his hand. Dad's plate smile collapsed. Even the catering staff froze in place. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then General Thaddeus Campbell did something no one on that porch expected. He did not continue toward the dining room. He did not acknowledge Julian's presentation folder. He did not ask about the architectural proposal. Instead, his posture straightened with the kind of precision that only comes from decades in uniform. His shoulders squared. His chin lifted slightly. Then, with deliberate control, he raised his right hand to his brow. It wasn't a casual greeting. It wasn't a friendly wave. It was a flawless military salute. Directed at me, not at my face, at my uniform, at the decorations on my chest, the entire courtyard fell silent. The only sound came from the spruce trees along the driveway, their branches shifting in the evening breeze. For a second, I saw disbelief look spread across every face around us. One server forgot she was holding a wine bottle. Another stood motionless with a tray balanced in both hands. Tabitha blinked several times as though her eyes had suddenly stopped cooperating. Julian looked from the general to me and back again, waiting for someone to laugh. Nobody did. I returned the salute, slowly, exactly as regulations required. Not because cameras were watching, not because anyone in the Sinclair family suddenly deserved an explanation, because respect inside the uniform had never depended on who happened to be standing nearby. The general lowered his hand. A smile finally crossed his face. Not the polished smile he'd offered my father, a genuine one. Captain Sinclair. His voice carried easily across the stone courtyard. It's good to see you again. Dad stared at me, then at the general. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. Julian recovered first. I'm sorry, General. He forced a laugh. I think there's been some misunderstanding. The general turned his head only enough to acknowledge that someone had spoken. There has. Julian relaxed slightly. I'm glad we're clearing it up. The general looked directly at him. The misunderstanding belongs to you. Julian's smile disappeared. Dad finally stepped forward. General Campbell, his voice cracked. I'm afraid my daughter may have misrepresented. The general raised one hand, not aggressively, simply enough to stop him. Mr. Sinclair. Dad fell silent immediately. I don't believe Captain Sinclair has misrepresented anything. Another long pause settled over the courtyard. Guests quietly exchanged confused looks. One retired judge whispered to his wife. Did he say captain? She nodded without taking her eyes off us. The general walked forward. He passed Julian first. The leather portfolio remained hanging awkwardly at Julian's side. Then he walked past Dad, past Tabitha, past the expensive floral arrangements, past every carefully planned detail of the evening. He stopped directly in front of me. For just a second, neither of us spoke. Then he extended both hands, not for a formal handshake. He clasped my right hand with both of his, firmly, warmly, the kind of greeting reserved for someone whose work had earned personal respect. Captain Sinclair, he said, the Joint Chiefs have been searching for your analytical counsel for 6 months. The words landed harder than any shout could have. I had no idea you were hiding in Ohio. Several guests gasped. Julian's portfolio slipped from his fingers and struck the stone walkway with a flat thud. Papers scattered across the ground. Nobody bent down to collect them. The general continued speaking. We were informed you declined 2 consulting appointments after retirement. I wasn't ready. He nodded. I respected that. His smile returned. But we've missed you. Dad looked as though he had forgotten how breathing worked. He swallowed. Know each other? The general glanced toward him. Captain Sinclair led one of the most capable analytical teams our logistics command has ever worked alongside. He looked back at me. Your threat assessments prevented mistakes that would have cost far more than money, I answered quietly. It was a team effort. He smiled again. That's exactly what I expected you to say. Julian suddenly interrupted. There has to be some confusion. Nobody acknowledged him. He stepped closer. General, I was told she handled supply paperwork. The general finally looked directly at Julian. She did. Julian brightened. I knew it. The general finished the sentence. Along with strategic network threat analysis, infrastructure security validation, and operational logistics architecture at levels you were never cleared to see. Julian's face drained of color. Dad instinctively reached for the crystal tumbler still resting on the porch railing. His fingers closed around it automatically. He lifted it halfway toward his mouth, stopped, looked at me again, then at the bronze star, then at the Valor device. Every accusation he'd made over the past week seemed to return all at once. Fake medals, stolen valor, plastic toys, warehouse clerk, supply girl. Each lie collapsed under the weight of one simple salute. His knees suddenly gave way. The crystal glass slipped from his hand. It struck the stone steps, shattered into dozens of sharp pieces. Amber scotch spread across the polished granite. Dad reached for the porch column, but missed it entirely. His vision seemed to empty behind his eyes. The last thing he saw before everything went black was the same daughter he had ordered to use the back entrance, now standing at attention, while one of the highest-ranking officers in the United States Army addressed her with unmistakable respect. Then Gideon Sinclair collapsed forward onto the front steps, and nobody moved to catch him. I watched the paramedics help my father onto a stretcher, while nobody seemed to remember that dinner had ever been the reason we were all standing there. Dad insisted he was fine. His blood pressure had simply crashed, according to the paramedic. Pride usually survives longer than dignity. The ambulance crew cleared him to remain home after a full examination, but the evening had already changed beyond repair. Nobody looked at Julian the same way anymore. Nobody looked at me the same way either. General Campbell turned toward the dining room. I believe your chef has gone to considerable effort. He smiled politely. It would be a shame to waste dinner. The sentence broke the tension just enough for people to move again. Servers resumed carrying plates. Guests slowly found their seats. Only the seating arrangement had quietly changed. Without anyone announcing it, the general asked me to sit beside him. Dad remained across the table. He barely touched his food. Julian looked like a man attending his own job interview after accidentally setting his resume on fire. For several minutes, conversation stayed comfortably ordinary. Travel, architecture, historic preservation, the chef's bourbon reduction. General Campbell complimented the vegetables before asking Dad about one of the firm's commercial projects. Dad answered mechanically. His confidence had disappeared somewhere between the salute and the ambulance. Then Julian saw an opening. He slid his leather portfolio across the table. General, if I may. The general nodded politely. Julian immediately brightened. I've prepared several recommendations for strengthening logistics security across regional infrastructure. He opened the binder. Charts, flow diagrams, military terminology sprinkled everywhere. He had spent a great deal of effort making it look impressive. The general quietly flipped through the first few pages. Then another, no expression. Finally, he stopped. His finger rested on one page filled with network validation procedures. He looked at me. Captain. Sir, do these look familiar? I leaned slightly closer. They did. Painfully familiar. They should. Julian smiled. I've spent months researching best practices. I closed the binder gently. No. I looked directly at him. You spent months rewriting them. His smile froze. General Campbell looked at the page again. This section, he tapped the margin, is nearly identical. Julian rushed to answer. Industry standards naturally overlap. The general calmly shook his head. Not these. He turned another page. The sequence numbering, another page. The authentication language, another. The contingency hierarchy. He closed the binder. I know these documents. Then he looked around the table so everyone could hear him. Captain Sinclair was the lead author of the modernization protocols your proposal attempts to reproduce. Silence. Real silence. Nobody even reached for a fork. Julian blinked twice. I wasn't aware. No, the general said calmly. You weren't. He rested one hand on the portfolio, because the complete versions were never publicly released. Julian's face turned pale. The general continued without raising his voice. The portions you found came from outdated reference material. He looked at me again. Captain Sinclair personally supervised the retirement of those coding standards. I remembered the briefing. 3 years earlier, windowless conference room, 42 pages of revisions, 12 agencies, months of coordination. Julian had copied obsolete material and dressed it up with fashionable business language. Dad slowly lowered his fork. You mean, the general answered before he finished. If Sinclair and Associates submitted this proposal during a federal review, he paused. It would raise immediate questions regarding technical competency. Julian tried again. I can revise it. No, the answer was immediate. You can withdraw it. The room became impossibly still. General Campbell closed the portfolio and slid it back across the table. I'll also be advising the acquisition office that your firm should not participate in upcoming logistics infrastructure bids until your compliance process receives its independent review. Nobody misunderstood what that meant. No contracts, no interviews, no second chances. Years of networking disappeared in one quiet paragraph. Dad closed his eyes, not dramatically, just long enough to understand what had happened. Everything he had trusted had been built on appearances. Dinner ended without another business discussion. Guests thanked the chef, shook hands, left quietly. No one asked me about the medals anymore. Respect had replaced curiosity. Before leaving, General Campbell handed me a simple business card. No gold lettering, no dramatic seal. Just a secure government contact number handwritten on the back. We still have an opening. I smiled. I know. When you're ready, I am. He nodded once. I thought you might be. The next morning, I packed exactly what I had arrived with. One olive drab duffel bag. Nothing more. The apartment took less than 10 minutes to empty. Martha hugged me before I reached the truck. You deserved better. I know, she smiled sadly. I'm glad someone finally noticed. So am I. Dad never came outside. Neither did Tabitha. Julian's car was already gone, probably searching for another room full of people who didn't know enough to question him. I carried my duffel toward the driveway and stopped beside the old cherry trees Grandma Eleanor had planted decades earlier. The house stood behind me, huge, silent, impressive. For the first time in my life, it looked small. I took one last look before opening the truck door. I used to believe that love was a silent pact of endurance, that if I compressed myself into the smallest possible space, I was protecting the comfort of the people who raised me. I wore my silence like a shield, letting them believe I was small, because I was terrified of finding out whether they would still recognize my face if I didn't hide my strength. But the gate taught me that sacrifice without boundaries is not humility. It is an invitation to entitlement. When you let people rewrite your value to fit their aesthetic, you are not being a good daughter or a good sister, are simply building the very cage they keep you in. My father measured human worth by the height of an office tower, the weight of an unearned title, or the luxury of an address. He could not see the steel inside his own daughter because his hands had only ever learned to grip things that came with a price tag. But true honor cannot be bought at a surplus store, and respect is not a currency you can extort over a family dinner. The star on my shoulder was earned in rooms they would have been too frightened to stand in, but it was the quiet boundary I drew on a Sunday afternoon that finally set me free. We do not owe our silence to keep our abusers warm. Sometimes the most loving, dignified thing you can do is to stop holding up a roof that was built to crush you, set the weight down, and walk out into the clean, honest light. And before you leave, look at the video on your screen right now. It is one of the stories viewers keep coming back to on this channel. Not because it is louder than this one, but because the truth lands even harder when the person being underestimated finally stops apologizing for surviving.